This is lecture 5 in the Western intellectual political tradition, and I want to focus on this short lecture on Socrates and the quest for wisdom. Often we think of philosophy, it comes from two Greek words, philia, which means to love, and wisdom, Sophia. And so philosophy is about the love of wisdom. Sometimes philosophy gets reduced to dissecting ideas, logic chopping, really a chess game of ideas, and that's never how the Greeks understood philosophy. For the Greeks, one of their questions is philia. As I mentioned, it's one of the 5 Greek words for love. But one of the questions they always ask themselves is, what holds a friendship together over the long duration of our life journey? And there are transient things which can temporarily hold people together. It can be work, it can be a sports event, it can be a variety of diversions, but once that project is done, once the work is over, once the sport event is over, people disperse, and it's a transient event that's done and over, and people are temporarily bonded. But for the Greeks, the question is, what is that thing which binds, knits people together over the long journey, which is permanent rather than that which is transitory? And for them it was Sophia. It was wisdom itself. And wisdom had a great deal to do with the shaping of character, what people let go of so they can come to know themselves and others on a much more deeper, substantive level. So it wasn't just dealing with the mind and ideas. It was very much about self-understanding. This is why in Greek philosophy to know oneself is substantive, the beginning really of wisdom, and it's also part of the process of growing into wisdom. But it wasn't an individual journey either. This is why philosophy is about philia. It's people, it's friends coming together, ever on the quest for that which is permanent, which is wisdom. And that's not something that people can have like sorting out and parsing a mathematical equation, or empirically making sense of something in biology or chemistry or physics. It's ever about feeling one's way to that which is deeper, more transformative, which is Lady Wisdom itself. And so philosophy, in that sense, is not something one gets from books or its ideas buzzing about in the head. It holds together a whole person, mind, body, soul, imagination, in terms of a journey to a new level of being itself. And often, sadly so, at an academic level, philosophy can really be reduced to just a bit of a mind game. And when that happens, people can get degrees in philosophy, and yet they can be deeply disoriented internally as well, because it hasn't gone deep, it hasn't affected them, it hasn't massaged them at a substantive level. But for the Greeks, only to engage in mental gymnastics and following premise to conclusion, and now does things make sense, would have missed the real purpose of learning and loving wisdom. For philosophy isn't about the love of knowledge, it's not about the love of information, it's about wisdom herself, which draws, which woos, which holds. And so when we think of philosophy in the whole Western tradition, it's probably we have to do a think about how has it been understood in its origins, and then how can it be distorted, and what is counterfeit philosophy, in which it really becomes demeaned and dimmed in terms of what the noble calling of a philosopher actually is, which is a shepherd of being. Heidegger understood this very, very clearly. Even though one could differ with his understanding of being, he understood rightly that it was about a way of understanding the self and being openness to something deeper and more substantive on the human journey. Now, Socrates is often seen as the font of Western philosophy. And the question always is, who is the real Socrates? Because we get Plato's Socrates, and in Plato's early, middle, and later writings, particularly in the early and middle writings, you'll get a certain understanding of Socrates. And to what degree is Plato redefining, giving us an understanding of Socrates? This is more about Plato's understanding of Socrates, in which the real Socrates, there's much more to him. So there is this ongoing discussion, obviously, because Socrates himself did not write. no more than Jesus wrote, and so you have people interpreting, reflecting on their lives. And so the Plato-Socrates discussion is an important one. But what I'd like to do in this lecture is look at a couple of features of Socrates and the quest for wisdom and some of the key elements of that particular journey. And so let me list a few of them here and then discuss them. The first of all, Socrates, as Plato understood him and wrote about him, was a gadfly. So there's always the status quo. It can be politically, it can be an understanding of identity, it can be an understanding of economics, understanding of religion, in which people don't think substantively about what they have internalized, been conditioned to understand, to see. The philosopher comes as a gadfly, challenging people to think a little deeper, and the positions they may hold in life may be quite valid. But what Socrates would do in his interaction with others, he would be asking them, oh, you believe this, now why do you believe it, and can you justify the particular decisions, and do they actually make sense? And so he asks, in that sense, he's a bit uncomfortable to be around a Socrates, because they probe, they pick, they're a gadfly in that sense, and ask of those they are interacting with that a little deeper thinking, a little deeper dives to the soul will be taken. And this is why he was a bit of an affront to the citizens of Athens at the time, particularly disturbing the status quo. The next element, so a gadfly for what, though? Merely to be a gadfly for the sake of being a gadfly is a bit of a cul-de-sac and a dead end. That just leads to critique, deconstruction, not accepting the status quo. And we have a lot of people who think that philosophy is just gadflyism, deconstructing people's understandings of what they think is important, religion and politics and economics and education and a variety of other elements in literature that make us a human. So the gadfly for what? For what purpose in that sense? Well, the second element of Socratic thinking is to be a midwife. So the next step is, midwife means a birthing, obviously. And so the question is, as a gadfly, being birthed from what to what? And the whole Socratic tradition takes the position that we live in a world of shadows. We live in a world of half understandings of the self. We live in a world in which often we indulge rather shallow desires that only lead us to greater restlessness. And we identify those desires, lower desires, often with our identity. And the more we indulge them, the more we bloat those desires. We think we are going to be happier, we're going to be fulfilled. And then our identity is hooked in with that. For Socrates, the question is, what is the self? If we are to love ourself or to know ourself, what does it mean to know the real self versus the counterfeit self, the self that is really just like a cloud that passes in the sky that has no substance whatsoever? So philosophy then is about midwifing. The corollary to midwifing itself for Socrates, as he's working through these particular issues, is to the student has to die. So philosophy was always at one level learning to die. So the question is, just as in being the midwife, just as in birthing, dying to what? What part of us are we to die to? What part of those things are we attached to? And of course, we can be attached to external things. It can be work, it can be amusements, it can be diversions, it can be wealth, it can be property, it can be knowledge, it can be information. But what is that part of us which gets attached to those things? That itself is what has to die, not the external objects we become attached to. And so, just as in classical thought, you have the hydra with its multiple heads. One can cut off the various heads of the hydra, of all these external things people become attached to, and yet the hydra will still live. And so what does one die to? It's the hydra within that does not know how to make meaningful choices, and it's in that being birthed then into a whole new level of being, which means people have to go much deeper into their own life, and that's what wisdom is about. It's about recognizing that we have conditioned, socialized impulses. Our culture, as it envelops us, surrounds us, predisposes us to see ourselves, our choices, our desires, our longings in a certain direction. And in the Socratic tradition, there has to be a sort of a death to those things, and then there is the birthing that takes place. And of course, the love of wisdom is not something that people have just because they're interested in it or have dissected some idea and they've come to conclusions and it's clear. Wisdom is something that a person is always dying and being reborn and dying, and so it's a process. We get our word kinesis, we get our English word kinesiology from that. So in Greek thought, people have this potential. Then through process kinesis, they can actualize that potential, but the potential itself can go into very different directions. A person can live at a fairly shallow, superficial level, and of course they may bud early in their life, but no substantive blossoms will come in their life or fruit on the tree of their new being. And it's not until there's a sort of a dying and being reborn again and again that in fact a new level of a being emerges. Now, within the love of wisdom itself, one then translates that into politics or the polis. The initial lessons are learned in Greek philosophy in the oikos, or the home, in which family, siblings, parents engage in the process of challenging, affirming, assisting one another in knowing themselves in a substantive level. But then the level of the oikos, the second level, is the role of education. And within the Greek educational setting, they did not have large classes like we did today, because it was the role of the teacher and the student to work very, very closely together. And the role of a teacher is not just to feed information, statistics, facts, teach a skill, or what we would call technique, but to draw people into wisdom, which was paideia in that classical sense. Eventually, the transition from the oikos, the home, through education to the polis was the next step in that process of growing in wisdom in the context of community. So friends were not just one or two, they were a group of people. This is why you'll often get in Platonic writings when Socrates is there. You'll go through the lower level often, in which Socrates will challenge people on basic logic. Are they following the ideas from premise? Does it make sense? Do you not like the conclusion or the consequences of choices made? Because often if one doesn't draw from a revelatory tradition, then one draws from an empirical tradition. Choices made, consequences lived with, either in thought or deed. Do you like the consequences? No. Then go back to the beginning and rethink why were those choices made that lead to those consequences. And so within the Socratic tradition of wisdom, there's not only the role of the individual and the community in the quest for wisdom, there's a series of birthing processes and dying in which person finally translates that into the polis itself, which is what it means to be a seeker of justice, which we'll be getting to in a few weeks in Plato's Republic and some of his other works. But Socrates stands back. Very important too within Socrates, as he comes near the end of his life, there's two things to note here, because Athens was coming to the end of its golden era when Socrates was there. They had lost some important wars. The period of what is seen as the high age of Athenian life had come to an end. And so Socrates was acting as a gadfly not only to individuals but to the city-state itself in Athens. He was a conservative in a deep sense, but not a conservative in the way we often see it today. Socrates would have transcended the simple categories of conservatism, liberalism, this notion of reflective thinking that's going somewhere in a telos, it has an end. It transcends simplistic categories of, say, in the States, you Republican, Democrats, or in Canada, Liberal, Conservative, NDP, Bloc, Green. There's much more deep work going on in terms of political philosophy from a Socratic, Platonic, and then Aristotelian tradition than we often get today in our understanding of politics and political philosophy. And sadly so, there's been a split between often people who do philosophy, people who do political science, and people who do political philosophy. And within this classical Athenian position, someone like Socrates has a much more organic understanding of what the role of political philosophy actually is. The last thing to note is Socrates is given a choice when he has been tried, found guilty of disturbing the peace in that sense. He has a choice of saying, because many of his friends and others said, listen, you can leave if you want. We'll find a way to spirit you out of Athens and you can live your life quietly and peacefully. Socrates has a sense of, holds together a tension, which the best philosophers always do, between being loyal to his people, loyal to the end, and yet critical. It's easy to be critical but loyal to nothing, not loyal to people, not loyal to community, not loyal to political parties, not loyal to religious communities, whatever. But criticism dominates. So a sense of cynicism, skepticism, the gadfly role dominates, but the loyalty elements disappears like a cloud. For Socrates, his view was, Athens is my family, it's my community. It's where I grew up, it's where I was nurtured, and it's where I will spend my days. Yes, I can be critical, but I also have to be loyal to my people, and if I've made a choice in which I threaten the stability, the order, the safety, the security as citizens have understood it, I will still be loyal to them to the end. And so in Socrates we have this notion of philosophy about dying. It's about being birthed, it's about being a gadfly, but it's also within a place, a specific area with people in which critical questions are asked, but the philosopher is loyal to the community of which he is a part. And this tends to run, of course, contrary to many of our liberal notions of in which the individual can be critical but loyal to nothing except criticism itself. Socrates is much more mature, and of course he suffers for doing that, for essentially telling citizens they were chasing shadows, chasing clouds, and he suffers the consequences. We'll find the same thing as we go through the class with Jesus. Very critical of a certain reed of his Jewish background, but very loyal to the people. They both die as a result of holding to a certain position in which loyalty to people, asking deeper questions, often being marginalized, just like the philosopher who leaves the cave, who could keep going because he has no patience for the herd in the cave, but returning to the cave to charitably be with the people in terms of exposing the shadows for what they are, but recognizing often being treated indifferently or rejected because of it. So Socrates, the quest for wisdom, puts in place an understanding of philosophy, which today many people don't understand in that deeper transformative sense. And that lays the foundation for a way of doing political philosophy also, in which people are both gadflies but loyalty to their community, to their polis.